Greetings, everyone. I hope you all have had a good break and have not forgotten all of your organic chemistry. We are going to pick up where we left off, and now we're going to start talking about a lot more in terms of reactions and reactivity. So, this week we are going to be talking about the functional group, the alkene, the carbon-carbon double bond. And the first thing to remind you or remind yourselves about is the difference between carbon-carbon single bonds and carbon-carbon double bonds. So here is a model of ethane, the simplest molecule that contains a carbon-carbon single bond. And like we talked about last week, these carbon-carbon single bonds rotate. You can draw Newman projections, figure out some energy differences between the Newman projections, and so forth. Pi bonds, on the other hand, so ethylene, we talked about this the first week of class. This molecule is a plant ripening hormone. But carbon-carbon double bonds, they are planar and they do not rotate. You can twist the model, but you cannot rotate the bond. And the reason for this, again, is the pi bond being above and below the molecule. If you were to rotate this carbon 90 degrees, you would break the bond. That's far too much energy to happen on a normal time scale. And so alkenes, unlike alkanes, these carbon-carbon double bonds do not rotate. So another thing with alkenes, or by way of reminder of what we've talked about recently, is that many alkenes have diastereomers. These carbons are sp2 hybridized, so they cannot be chirality centers or asymmetric centers, as your book calls them, but they can be stereocenters. So they can have cis-trans isomers, which we will talk about, and then there's a related type of isomer for alkenes. So while alkenes do not necessarily have enantiomers, often alkenes have diastereomers. The simplest example of that is 2-butene. So there is that molecule, and there is that molecule. Both of these are 2-butenes, CH3, CH, CH, CH3, CH3, CH, CH, CH3. But because this bond cannot rotate, these two molecules are diastereomers. They have the same connectivity. They are not superimposable. They are not mirror images, so they must be diastereomers. This molecule is in fact simple enough that we can classify it as cis or trans just in the same way that we can classify disubstituted cyclohexanes as cis or trans. In this case, both that methyl group and that methyl group are on the same side of the pi bond. So this is a cis isomer. This one, the one up top, on the other hand, is a trans isomer because the two methyl groups are on opposite sides of the pi bond. So we've talked about primary, secondary, tertiary carbons and hydrogens and alcohols and that sort of thing. And I'd like to introduce a couple more related pieces of terminology that have to do with alkenes. The allyl carbon and the vinyl carbon, or the allyl group and the vinyl group. So why don't I draw 2-butene again. So there's 2-butene again. I've drawn the cis isomer. This carbon right here is a vinyl carbon. The carbon that is part of the alkene is a vinyl carbon, just like this carbon right here is also a vinyl carbon. We can also term that hydrogen as a vinyl hydrogen, or that hydrogen as a vinyl hydrogen. This methyl group is directly attached to the alkene. It itself is sp3 hybridized. This is called an allyl group. So allyl means essentially right next door to an alkene. So this methyl group is allyl. You could also describe these hydrogens as allyl if there were an alcohol there or an alkyl halide. You could call that allyl. So for example, this molecule here, it's an alcohol. This alcohol is attached to a carbon that is directly attached to the alkene. So this molecule is called allyl alcohol. Similarly, this molecule that I've drawn here, well, it's an alkene. It's like ethylene, and it's got a chlorine attached to the alkene. It's a chlorine attached to the vinyl carbon. This molecule is vinyl chloride. And you'll recognize this because when you polymerize this molecule, it becomes polyvinyl chloride. So we'll talk more about polymers and that sort of thing as we go through the second term. The last thing I want to leave you with this movie is this molecule and talk about the NMR of this molecule. This molecule, we've got an acetate group. You may recall this structure is called acetate. And so this molecule, well, we've got a very simple alkene attached to an acetate. So this molecule is called vinyl acetate. And what I've shown here is the NMR structure of vinyl acetate. And so let's look at this for a second here. What do we expect to see on this structure, and what do we actually see? This methyl group is that peak. It's got an integration of about 3. Initially, we might expect, okay, there's that hydrogen, and there are these 2 hydrogens. So we would expect, okay, there is going to be a triplet. It's next door to 2 hydrogens. And these are going to have an integration of 2 and be a doublet, but that's not what we see. This is what we see. We see 3 unique peaks. One of these hydrogens is this peak, and one of those hydrogens is that peak. There are 2 separate peaks. And again, that comes from this whole idea that these bonds can't rotate. So this hydrogen is always going to be cis to the acetate group, and this hydrogen is always going to be trans to that acetate group. They're in different chemical environments. They will produce 2 different signals. In addition, this hydrogen that's connected to, this is also a vinyl hydrogen, so it also is going to show up in the alkene range, but the one that I've circled in yellow is responsible for this peak. And you'll notice this peak is not a triplet. What is it? It's 4 individual peaks. It's what we call a doublet of doublets. It's because this hydrogen and this hydrogen are unique, so each of them split it into a doublet. They split it differently, and so rather than a triplet, you get 4 peaks, a doublet of doublets. And each of these has an integration of 1, about 1/3 of the integration of that. So that's your first lesson on alkenes. I'll see you in class next week, and we'll talk about their chemistry, how to react with them, and I'll also post a movie about how to name them. See you soon.